Hello, dear viewers. You're at Real Turkey channel with your loving, caring presenter Atilla Yeşilada. I'm doing another video about Turkish elections, which is a marathon process. The second round for the presidency is scheduled for 28th of May. Now, in my previous video, I made a forecast for the election results, which turned out to be almost completely wrong, which is not unusual for those of you who know me from my past as an economist and commentator in Turkey. I'm frequently wrong. But I was right in one part, in the sense that there will be a second round in the presidential elections, though I had predicted that going into the second round, the opposition candidate, Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu, would have the edge. He doesn't. I'm not gonna call his defeat certain. He stands probably a 20% chance of stealing victory out of the jaws of defeat. But I don't want to waste time talking about his economic policies simply because I've done several videos about Kılıçdaroğlu, the opposition National Alliance, and the possible policy courses they're going to adopt. In a sense, they're going to be very orthodox. So, Econ 101. We would have seen economic policies similar to those conducted in Brazil, the United States, Germany, almost in any country except North Korea, by the way. So, Turkey and you, if you are still interested in Turkey, need to be prepared for another 5 years of the Erdogan regime. And now I make the bold prediction that under his policies, Turkey is headed for a polycrisis, which is a new term coined by economists to make sure no one understands what they're saying, so we pay them money for consultancy. Polycrisis means there will be several different shocks culminating in a crisis. Now, if you watch this channel or follow Turkey through the international press, you would see that there is widespread condemnation and criticism of Erdogan's economic policies, which are briefly insane, and they brought Turkey to the edge of ruination. During the election campaign, he didn't hint that he would change those. In fact, he reiterated several times that the main pillar of his heterodox economic policy, which is keeping interest rates at a very low level despite soaring inflation, will remain intact. For a while, he flirted with the idea of bringing back former economy supremo Mr. Mehmet Şimşek, a very well-respected economist whom I happen to know personally. Mr. Mehmet Şimşek and his predecessor, Mr. Ali Babacan, are known for their orthodox economic policies, their conventional management of the economy, which had resulted in fairly good outcomes. But apparently, Mehmet Şimşek doesn't want to come back in an official capacity. In any case, it doesn't matter whom he puts in this critical cabinet positions. At the end, Mr. Erdogan runs the show, and he is determined to carry the experiment called the new economy model to its bitter end. So, unless I'm completely wrong, and someone beats sense into his head, so he reverts to a more conventional economy course, Turkey is heading for a polycrisis. Polycrises will come in 4 varieties, which I shall describe in the bulk of this broadcast. But before I get there, let's take just a 2-minute detour to explain where I went wrong. This is probably not necessary for the casual viewer. You can skip 2 minutes ahead, but I think for ethical reasons and to be accountable to my core audience, which is like 250 people or so, as to where I made mistakes. So autocriticism is important to me. Essentially, there are 4 things I missed. By the way, when I made the previous video where I issued my call for the elections, I was essentially voicing the opinion of a majority of polling agencies. They were all wrong. And at this point, they're scratching their head to find out what the hell went wrong. There has been some preliminary research on what they got wrong, and I'm simply voicing those. I'm only adding one conclusion of my own. 4 things, as I've said. A, there has been a nationalist groundswell, a trend that we couldn't detect. It's not clear why, probably in response to the huge amount of refugees in Turkey, estimated anywhere around 8 to 10 million in a population of 85 million, which the nationalists think are stealing our jobs and, to put it very, very rudely, looking at our women. So, several nationalist parties got roughly 25% of the vote, led by Mr. Erdogan's ally, Mr. Bahçeli, whose MHP got 10% of the vote. Prior to the election, the average of polls gave his party at best 7%, so there's a 3% deviation there. 2, I had misestimated or underestimated the impact of Mr. Erdogan's massive pork barreling. Now, note this, put a check mark next to it because it's going to be important in the part about why Turkey is headed for a crisis. Essentially, he spent huge amounts on every identifiable constituency. Now, obviously, I saw this coming, but Erdogan has never really resorted to such crass pork barreling, so I was wrong about the magnitude. I was also wrong that whatever he spent would be trumped by rising inflation, and people are very likely not to vote for him as long as inflation is going up. That's where I went wrong. People apparently somehow learned to cope with inflation and were happy that Mr. Erdogan was just pouring cash, Benjamins, into their wallets. 3, it appears the second largest party of the Nation Alliance, İYİ party, voters, roughly 1.6% of them in terms of the national votes, refused to vote for Kılıçdaroğlu and went to the protest candidate Sinan Ogan. 3, apparently a lot of CHP voters, Kılıçdaroğlu's party, boycotted the polls simply because 2 reasons. A, they thought the warm relationship between Kılıçdaroğlu and pro-Kurdish rights HDP, now called the Green Left Party, is tantamount with cooperation with the terror organization PKK. 2, CHP incorporated 4 smaller parties into his rosters, Saadet, Gelecek, Deva, and Democratic Party. And 2 of these, Gelecek and Deva, are founded by former AKP heavyweights, Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu and economy czar Mr. Ali Babacan. That didn't sit well with the average CHP voter. Prior to the elections, the average of polls showed CHP scoring 29% of the national vote. It scored around 25.7% of the national vote. So I suppose the deficit was essentially CHP voters boycotting the polls. Now, can Kılıçdaroğlu win? I'll assign him at best 20% chance in the sense that, the vote is out there. I mean, he needs to find at least 3 million new votes above and beyond what Erdogan may add to his total to win this election. And if all İYİ voters and CHP voters who boycotted the election report to the polls, he may win, but I'm going to be realistic about that. I'm going to call this election going to Erdogan in the second round. Now, Turkish economy is in huge turbulence, which was papered over by pre-election spending. That spending, pork barreling, in my humble estimate, amounted to 4% of Turkish GDP. On top of that, you have to add roughly 2% of GDP in terms of necessary, unavoidable earthquake spending. So, compared to what we had by the January, the budget deficits will be larger to the tune of 6% of GDP. That's roughly $55 billion that Erdogan will have to find. Otherwise, budget deficits will explode. And that kind of explains why, after the first round disappointment for the opposition voters and for the investors who believed that Kılıçdaroğlu would win, there has been a huge sell-off in Turkey's credit default swap prices, as well as in Turkey's euro bonds. A lot of investors think there is no way Erdogan can cover these deficits, and at the end, if you can cover your budget deficits, you are going to have a default. Can Erdogan find that 6%? I think he can raise taxes, but it's very difficult to generate substantial amount of budget revenues by raising taxes. Perhaps out of the 6% of GDP additional spending, 1.5% can be compensated by higher taxes. He can probably borrow more, mostly at home, not necessarily abroad, by simply shoving very low-yielding government bonds into the balance sheets of commercial banks. But that also has a limit in the sense that he also wants to keep the economy going very hot, for which, of course, the banks need to make loans. And if you force them to convert all of their deposits into government bonds, there will be no cash left for loans. So that value is also limited, which means that a lot of this additional spending will have to be covered by money printing. And that's hugely inflationary. So that's the first leg, or first shock of the polycrises I described in my title, which is, well, let me put it here. So the first leg of the polycrises is going to be a surge in inflation, which will probably come towards the end of the summer months. Since no one believes the data published by the official statistics agency Turkstat, I don't know what the official rate will be, but I would estimate that Turkish inflation will rise at least by 20 percentage points. So if you go by official data, the prediction for year-end is roughly 40% in CPI terms, let's say 60% inflation. And since Mr. Erdogan refuses to use monetary policy or budget cuts to control inflation, it's going to get worse as the calendar advances. Of course, that prediction is made on the base of the assumption that Turkish currency exchange rate will remain stable because there is a high pass-through from exchange rate devaluation to higher inflation. If the central bank cannot control the exchange rate, the inflation forecast will also be higher. That's the second point. Turkey is running out of foreign exchange. The central bank has sucked up all the foreign FX deposits and banks' FX holdings to its balance sheet, and it has wasted most of those. As of last Thursday, the FX reserves of central bank were at minus $71 billion. That is a technical definition. It doesn't, mean much. Gross reserves, so net reserves plus whatever central bank borrows from friendly central banks and from banks are still a comfortable $100 billion, but most of it is not convertible. So given the fact that we have a current account deficit, given the fact that a lot of Turkish depositors don't want to stay in Turkish lira deposits and want to go back to FX, Turkey is running into troubles controlling the currency. Now, as I've said, allowing the currency to depreciate, which would balance the current account balance and current account deficit and reduce demand from domestics for hard currency, is very unpleasant for Mr. Erdogan. It's going to lead to an inflationary boom. Also, he has to keep in mind that in March 2024, Turkey will hold local elections, which are as essential to him as the general and presidential elections. If he wants to preserve the loyalty of his constituency, he must at least capture back cities like Istanbul, Ankara, because that's where most of the welfare spending takes place. So Turkey is going to run out of foreign currency. When? Not certainly not during the summer months, because we're going to have a huge tourism season. I think the consensus is something like $50 billion in gross revenue, most of which would accrue in the 4-month period between June and October. So in the summer, the central bank will be able to replenish its FX reserves, and pressures on the currency will be relatively manageable. But come winter months, when the economy is still hot, so there is, huge import demand. Exports are slowing down because, according to the latest forecast, EU is slowing down. And presumably, not necessarily oil prices, but natural gas prices will be going up again. Turkey will simply not have enough foreign currency to service its foreign debt and to pay for its imports. So the first measure would be capital controls and import controls. Capital controls, currency controls, you have heard that expression anymore. Essentially, the FX deposits of companies and individuals in the banks will be frozen. They will not be able to conduct transactions in them freely, and these will be used to cover Turkey's import needs and to make payments on foreign debt. But it only goes so far. I mean, capital controls work if at the same time the government changes economic policy and addresses the root cause of this imbalance between currency outflows and inflows. But Erdogan really doesn't believe in the conventional theory. He's not going to do that. So at some point we're talking about defaults. Probably Turkish public debt, Treasury issued Eurobonds, and other state obligations, such as obligations of state banks, are safe because they are not a huge portion of Turkey's total annual foreign debt service requirements, which are roughly $200 billion. But banks won't be able to renew their loans. Private sector will not be able to pay back its maturing bonds and loans. And you know what happens to a country that goes into default. It's completely shut off from global credit and bond markets. That leg of the polycrisis will probably be accompanied by banks going insolvent, such as those that happened in the United States, bank failures. Now, bank failures are a strange business. Banks don't fail because they run out of capital or even liquidity. They fail because the banking regulator pulls the plug on them. Since Turkey's banking regulator is slavishly devoted to Erdogan, that may be delayed. But there's another scenario where several banks go, default or go bankrupt, which is a run on deposits. Obviously, I have described a lot of crises. These are going to lead to a collapse in, economic confidence. Turkey's savers may plausibly think that their deposits are not safe in banks, in any bank, and may wish to withdraw their money to store them, as the Turkish saying goes, under their mattresses or in their personal vaults. In which case, banks will not be able to honor these withdrawal requests, and they'll have to shut their doors. And then, of course, the state deposit insurance agency takes over. They become state banks, and the deposits of the savers will be made whole by the state. But in any case, you have bank defaults. So that's a pretty dire scenario. Is there any way to get out of it? Well, obviously, policy change, Erdogan turning pragmatic and allowing higher interests, cuts in budget spending, all sorts of things that countries that engage upon an austerity program do. But even if he does, the root cause of Turkey's FX shortage will not be solved because he doesn't have any credibility. In the past, when economically cornered, Mr. Erdogan changed tack and allowed higher interest rates and promised never to interfere in monetary policy. These episodes lasted at most 6 months. Mr. Erdogan is Mr. Erdogan. At this age, he's 69, he's not going to change. And a lot of investors have experience with Mr. Erdogan's zigzags, so even if he engages upon an austerity program, the ability to draw large amounts of foreign funding or loans from abroad is going to be very limited. 2, he can invite IMF. Now that I cannot rule out. He's not going to do so when the symptoms of an oncoming crisis are apparent. He's not that kind of a man. But when the central bank asks for an audience and tells him, boss, really, we don't have cash and banks want their cash back, so, you got to come up with a solution, he might invite IMF. He might eat humble pie, he hates IMF, and sign under a standby program. But that is going to be extremely painful for Turkey because obviously IMF too doesn't trust Erdogan. Turkey will have to make huge budget cuts and announce huge rate increases which are going to push the economy into a deep recession. So, on Sunday, Turkey, next Sunday, not this Sunday, Sunday 28th of May, Turkey is actually voting for its economic future. If Turkey chooses Erdogan, which is the most likely scenario, they will also be voting for economic crises. You know the saying, Vox Populi, Vox Dei, the voice of the nation, voice of gods. And if a nation wishes to be governed that way, well, that's what they deserve. Thank you very much for watching Real Turkey channel videos. I would appreciate if you subscribe or share this video by other Turkey enthusiasts. See you soon in another video. This is Atilla Işılada saying goodbye from Istanbul.